Hello. Today, a very important musical genre topic. Tombeau, hommage, Memento Mori. In the very early Baroque already, there was an homage that was paid musically by composers who wanted to honor the memory of another composer who had died. It could be lutenist, could be clavecinist, as in French they call the harpsichordists. And Froberger, who was a German composer and traveled through many countries in Europe, especially Italy, where he studied with Frescobaldi, and then he was at the court of Versailles, where he met with Louis Couperin and, of course, Jean-Henri d'Anglebert, both students of Jacques Champion de Chambonnières. And this genre became something of a reflection upon death. Of course, the death of the given guest, friend, or colleague, or honoring the person. That's not a quotation musically of a composer's given genre of composing or some kind of style, compositional. It was mostly something like saying, I'm doing and I'm playing a reflection upon the death, and therefore somehow on my own death as well, or the finitude as such. And I find that very touching. And Bach himself, in his fourth partita of dances in D major, has this very, very, very deeply emotional, moving self-search in this Allemande opening dance movement, where he expresses this kind of reflection upon one's own death. These are the kind of things that Froberger did himself. Réflexion sur ma propre mort. And so it can be in major. It doesn't have to be in minor in terms of the mode in the Baroque times to be associated to sad or anguished, obviously, but there are elements of chromaticism, elements of articulation, anticipations on appoggiaturas, suspensions, delays, hanging on a thread of a diminished seventh chord, all these kind of psychological manipulations in the rhetoric of the eloquence of the expression of the musical text that was spoken more than sung. And this wasn't music to soothe, perhaps it was not the music for solace. It was music for self-interrogation about, am I ready for my own end on earth? And when my colleague died, I felt like one of us, it's a collegial thing, died. We need to write a piece to be played. So while we play this piece, we think of this colleague who died. He was the lutenist Gautier or Blanc-Rochet, and Louis Couperin and Froberger wrote tombeau or grave in French, or therefore a way to say that this music is to mark the death of one of our colleagues, and as well, as I said earlier, a reflection upon my own death, Memento Mori in Italian. And I find that it is so touching, moving, emotional, deeply personal. of course, metaphysically, spiritually, something that is not openly stated in treatises and in books, like the tonal system, the ornamentation table, the degree of importance of the essential ways of learning how to disseminate the knowledge of performing expressively on the harpsichord, as later C.P. Bach would do in his Versuch, his essay on expressive performing on the harpsichord. I think in general the treatises are more about the technique. And here we talk about the spirituality. We talk about a sense of reflection in musical aspect upon one's own end, finitude. And I find that in this D major Allemande that Bach wrote to open the series of dances after the French overture prelude of the fourth suite, I was going to say, but it's the same thing, partita of dances. The traditional Allemande is a 4/4 dance, relatively square, if not a bit heavy. In other words, relatively stable, and opening the series of dances, which we have the Italianate corrente, the South American, but slowed down to a very stately tempo sarabande, slow dance, and then of course you'll have minuet, gavotte, bourrée, perhaps even other kinds of shorter French dances which are light-minded, or and therefore comes the final but most exciting jig, or jig in Irish pronunciation, I guess, since it's attributed to that country. But the point is that it has this kind of uplifting, literally, ending where men dance and jump as high as they can to impress the ladies. And this manly dance at the end is sort of the suite of dances, let's say, culmination point of excitement. And this is a very important fact, that the suite of dances was started by the French clavecinists, as we think mostly. And in the 17th century, they chose a certain series of dances. They didn't compose them each for each of their suites, because they were in different tonalities, but the tuning of the harpsichords were to be played in a single key, after which if you venture in another tonality, you might get in trouble, because the perfect pure thirds, the major ones, resonate well in the key for which you will play, and therefore all the dances of the suite are in the same key, in D major, in G major, in A major, in F major, in whichever tonality. But you don't venture in other keys, because it will sound with beating of the resonance of the echo of the response of the wave of the tone of the sound, and you'll hear dissonant, out of tune, basically, situation. And so they had to write, and they did, multitude of each of these genre of dances, stylized for the harpsichord, that were also played on the lute originally. And of course the keyboard of the harpsichord brought the instrument to become a little more digital and less transportable than the lute, but nevertheless also as was the lute with the many strings, especially in the back, was also both harpsichord and lute were instruments for polyphony. And polyphony was so important to express yourself with secondary thoughts besides the melodic first thought. So it's important to take that in account, because most of music outside of the Western European area was monodic, was more sung, it was one voice, and eventually the instruments supported that voice. But the polyphony and the complexity of the contrapoint, or the ways of organizing in good behavior, um, a group of movements of voices which inevitably become like a tree with branches. I like this kind of way of imagining it, that develops in a harmonious way. Harmonious meaning the instruments or the voices that are expressed through the instruments become part of the expression of the multitude that lives in good, coherent togetherness. Um, and it is true that it avoids conflicts. What are conflicts? I'm sorry. Conflicts would be dissonance, inevitably. Attacked instrumental intervals like fifths and octave by direct motion, and having something harsh in the voice leading, especially the inner voice leading, not the melodic or the bass line, which should be anyway the lines that guide us. And in the Baroque music, the bass line, basso continuo, creates the melodization that comes on the top. In the Baroque, but in the Romantic, it's the opposite. It's the melodic line that creates a harmonization. And in a way, it becomes more vertical, where you have the two hands of the harpsichord becoming fortepiano or piano, who play together. And therefore, in the Baroque era, 17th century, the lines were layered on top of each other. They created vertical arrival points in terms of the cadential punctuations, but in terms of the point A to point B, they took different trips and made different intervals and different gestures and different elements of expression, which I think is so important to take in account for the flourishing, the blossoming of the thought of the composers, of the artists, of the poets, of the theater writers, of the philosophers of these ages, when they were rethinking how art is supposed to reflect not only life but the afterlife, the expression of hope for that, and the desperation of the finitude on earth, the fact of living on the moment at most, because we don't know what tomorrow will bring us. So it's not about hedonism and self-serving in pleasures. Well, I'm sure many in the past did that after all. But the point is that at the level of a spiritual uplifting of societal awareness through these artists and these thinkers and these poets, in the best sense of the word poets, who sing the words, who sing the thoughts, who put in melodization, in voicing the awareness of humanity philosophically about where they come to, where they go, and what they do. And of course, you have oppression in terms of political oppression, you have fear, and you have the way to govern by oppression and fear that was essential for all these centuries and way before as well, Baroque, which unfortunately survived later too, in terms of the fact that the humans were impeached to think on their own. And so the philosophers, the writers, the poets, and to a certain extent the musicians, perhaps not right away as controversial as the thinkers and the writers and the poets, and especially the philosophers, they were suspicious of course, since there was a general populations kept in analphabetization, they couldn't read on their own. In 1492, before the Baroque, obviously, when the publishing was enabled um, in Mainz, Germany, by Gutenberg. Gutenberg, sorry. Gutenberg was the birth to what will become through Martin Luther the capacity for all to read the Bible on their own and not have only those who know in Latin how to copy it, those monks, for the church system of pyramidal system of knowledge, where at the bottom of which the people were just there to observe the canonic rules of the religion, which is mostly fear. Fear the superiors and fear everything, death, of course, and then have indulgences that they could purchase in order to get into a hope for an afterlife. And all these, in fact, business of of selling afterlife indulgences, as they used to call it in the Catholic Church at the time, and then through the colonizations of the South America, Africa, and other countries and continents, and Asia was the beginning of the globalization of this Christianity to scare and keep the people from thinking on their own, but by being analphabetized and not being able to read in Latin the Bible, since they have no idea how to speak or read Latin, except the words that they have to learn for their religious recitations of their prayers. And so the idea that in the age of enlightenment, the philosophers and then the reform of the church with Martin Luther bringing through the published Bibles the capacity in the country of their own, for instance in German language, to be able to read the gospel for all the worshippers was a democratization. No more just expected to be read to them ex cathedra from the church's pulpit, and they could also, between the services, read on their own, reflect on their own about the different aspects of what they're told through the Bible. And I find that all this put together, you have this musical genre of the tombeau that is very expressive and meaningful, and in fact, very human, deeply so. And when Bach writes this Allemande, he doesn't quote or call it in terms of title, that is a tombeau or reflection on my own death. He didn't, but when we observe the homages or the tombeaus of Froberger or of Louis Couperin, we realize that there is a genre that traveled through Europe that incorporated in other pieces this element. It didn't have to be the title and the piece for that specifically, but it could be a moment of reflection about one's own finitude inside an Allemande opening stately dance of a suite, as Bach did in his D major one. And I find that when we listen to it, we realize that he goes through so many depictions of elements of anxiety, hope, excitement, elegance, gestures, intervals, rising intervals, rising soulfully intervals, in my view at least. Now, perhaps I oversee in that my own desire to depict and therefore convince you that I think Bach was saying this. In fact, perhaps we should stay, and I personally should stay a little more distant, and when playing it, implement it through my eloquence of the intervals. The upper sixth hugging the fifth melodically is like an appoggiatura for the interval that is perfect, but the sixth is major or minor. It's already an emotional gesture of a leap of an interval, of a hope when you rise, and then you cling on the fifth, which is the interval that is not major nor minor, the fifth, the circle of fifths. So you have a different leap of the octave, which is even more meaningful when you have a five at most octave harpsichord. An octave leap is a lot compared to the 8-octave piano, where it seems relatively diluted in its audacity. Of course, everything is to be contexted. And if you put in context those gestures in terms of intervals, of choices of chromaticisms, of dissonant intervals, diminished fifth, or so-called triton, devil in music is the early Christian singing of the Gregorian singers were doing by avoiding it, because it was creating the desire for a release from attention, and therefore music had to reflect only the heavenly non-human tension release necessities of the being, but to think of spiritual uplifting to be beyond these calls of nature, and therefore they avoided this diminished fifth, which in fact is the tonal system's padlock. It's also its unleashing of the tension and the release. You close it to a third, you open it to a sixth. This diminished fifth, no wonder they call it diabolus in musica, the devil in music. So of course you have these intervals that are choosily used. I call it, well, they are called chromatic. Today we might not, but it was then a chromatic interval. Chroma in Greek means color. I don't think it meant that literally, but it was compared to this step or semi-step. It's all semi-step. And so the chromaticism is in fact a way to construct a tension which calls for a release in major or in minor. And therefore they have diminished thirds also, which sound like major seconds, but they're not. F sharp, A flat, which should have been F A. And then once you go A flat, you close, F sharp, you rise to get to the G, the dominant. So you squeeze, you use an interval which in fact becomes at that point squeezed is perhaps a little bit of a tight word or strong word. I don't know if I'm using the right words. I don't have a musicological lingo as I should to speak about things of such nature, because then they're more respectful. I call sometimes when you have a major second the kissing notes, but of course that is not musicological at all. But I like to hear it because I think that in a way you have the resolution and the tension at the same time. If you have a dominant on G in C and you have an A on top that goes on that G unison, what else can it be but a kissing tone? But of course these are not, I should not indulge in such expressions of unserious musicological terminology. All I can say is that regardless how we call the elements that are displayed in this expression of self-search, in the expression of articulations through, let's say, decorative patterns in the melodic line that acts in fact more like a monologue, and the left hand of the harpsichord or the keyboard in general, there is more about reflective two parts that do a very subdued dialogue, while the very decorated 30 seconds, triplets, sixteenths, eighth notes, all kinds of variety of articulated rhythmicity that written down defines something that should sound like improvised. Doesn't always correspond, thankfully, to Bach's ingenious ways, to the beats of the left hand. So that you have this kind of free-floating, decorative, detailedly notated in very detailed fast values. Of course, played slowly, they don't rush fast, but observed on a score, they look like some kind of necklace or some kind of decorative system which posed or superimposed on the melodic bassline accompaniment allows to bring out the thought process that stays in one's mind through the left hand and extroverts these ideas about hope and despair and fear of that finitude. You have these tritons, as I mentioned, these diminished intervals, and they all arrive before the downbeat with a tie on the next beat. And these ties connect the melodic thought process to another line, to another note, and it becomes a run-on sentence. And it becomes like going through the harmonizations, which bring us in different tonalities through modulation, secondary dominance, major, minor effects of choice, but mostly in the atmospheric surrounding of this melodic line that talks, that speaks, that is eloquently elevating our spirits. And in a way, sometimes disturbingly, in the sense of direct thought statement without gloves, without beautification, without seduction, without politeness, goes directly for a dissonance or attacks triton or becomes an interval that lingers before its release from the tension it produces, either with the melodic bass line, either on its own graphic of emotional suggestion under the note or above the note, appoggiatura or accacciatura, or port de voix as it's called in the French Baroque, under the note, from above the note, but delaying the note, either by suspension, either by what we call retardation, from suspension from under the note. And so it's all about where the bass is compared to where this note will be delayed from above, from underneath, or played directly in dissonance to create an essence of emotional dissonance, which creates then the necessity for a consonance. And how do you console after the dissonance? And all these things are very subtle. They're not effectual things that can be displayed like forte piano on the instrument that is meant for this dynamics to come after the harpsichord. It's about delaying breathing, delaying the meaningful note, either by these melodic ways of going around, by the appoggiatura, cacciatura, and other effects, but also by the breathing between the notes, even if the harpsichord doesn't need to breathe, or the keyboard of the piano neither. But you delay it, you place it as a exhaling instead of not inhaling. So you have an imitation of the voice spoken for its rhetoric or its punctuation, as well as sung. Some sections are more lyrically sung, some sections are spoken like a recitativo. And so you have in Bach's Allemande all of the above, dispersed, displayed in ways that are just unbelievably eloquent and convincing and emotionally charged, I find. But perhaps not everybody finds them charged. Regardless, I do. And when I play, I try to keep not the details overstating, but the whole expression fitting inside these delays, expectations, anticipations, angst, and excitements, and elegant gestures, and elegant everything. Elegance is more about the way of not becoming overwhelmed in the display of the chromaticisms of the angst, but also keeping a certain decorum about it. And Bach is very good at that. in the way that he expresses this nobility of being, regardless of the level in society of that nobility. It's not to do with the power or the richness. It's about the fact that you conceal some of the angst within a gesture of reassurance. And that I find to be so meaningfully, emotionally, and beautifully infectious in Bach's music. That's kind of solace through the well-being of the hope that is rooted in his belief, and then he displays the different. He paints our soul's search in his sounds and in his eloquent spoken talk, Sprachgesang, which was be later used for operas after recitativi in German, where it was spoken sung. And I think it's in the recitativos of these right hands opening sections, the expression of all of humanity within few of those interval gestures. How marvelous that we receive from these masters such an incredible history of life as thought by them for us. this intimacy with the universal and the personal, expression of human search, Sehnsucht inside our search, in our soul search, is so expressive of the emotions of humanity, or human rather, versus the humanity as a group, individually, like expressed in this right hand's decorative patterns, gestural expressions of intervals, of delays, of anticipations, of dissonant reachings of a real tone just before, under, or just after, above, until finally comes to fruition. How come that not be romantic, as people mistakenly consider it for romance when they say you cannot play or shouldn't play or shouldn't think Baroque music, let less Bach, therefore in it at its high Baroque, end of the Baroque era, before the classical era, as we call it, comes in with Haydn's Viennese school, to not be played romantically, as if romanticism belongs only to the romantic era, which we consider then in the second half of the 19th century to flourish into the modernity of the early 20th century, where we reject tonality and in societal systems, the oppressing empires, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Prussian. And in fact, all this leads us to the 1918. And in fact, the time periods are very clustered in some way. You think about Bach's death in 1750 and Chopin's death in 1849 is 99 years. So much has been developed in the expression of humanity, of each individual human in their expression. Of course, there is no question that the liberation of the expression of one's feelings beyond the formal obligations that Haydn established for the sonata, as well as Bach with the fugues or the system of dances, and Bach didn't only do that, other wrote fugues before him, but the polyphony, the organization of the thoughts, the formal structures, the usage of music as a necessity to be either for church use, therefore for spiritual uplifting, or then secular for dancing or for imitation of different emotions of life, therefore through theater representing life artificially or its own flaws to make us aware of them, and therefore add music and dance to it, as Lully did for Louis XIV court in Versailles, and it became théâtre lyrique et dansé. And so all the forms of art can be and are combined in order to answer to a spiritual quest. And in this very subdued in form and in genre and in instrumentarium or presentation of a monologue with harmonic melodic bass lines accompaniment of this Allemande of Bach's fourth partita in D major. So much is hinted, so much is said, so much is soul painted about our own hopes, and all this reference to the different aspects of human angst, human hope, human projection, human desire, human need, human solace, for the experience of the psychological aspects of life that are described by painters, poets, writers, theater players, sculptors, all kinds of artists who through their art forms express what human can shape from nature to represent it. In a way, and therefore it's a mirror of our soul, or it's a horror of our soul, or is a hope for our soul. And this romanticism, which is sometimes wrongly understood when we are told don't play Bach romantic, as if Bach is supposed to be in his expression only formal and distant and unexpressive in the sense of humanity expressing itself. And I find that, of course, you cannot compare an opera by Verdi, opera by Bizet, like Carmen, where the music exalts sensuality for Carmen or exalts desperation and drama. It's just incredibly true that, in a way, there is an opening of freeing, rather, from the formality to the informal, explosive, perhaps not as the word, but um, ex in Latin being, of course, the prefix for bringing out, expectoration, that's a very strong word, of the human reflection upon our destiny. And perhaps when I play as I do the Allemande, I bring out a lot the melodic line of the bass that spawns the melodic line. And then the melodic line has this hesitance, this anticipations according to the different rhythmic patterns that he uses for the decorations of the 30 seconds. Fa mi re do in the 30 seconds, or in the 30 seconds by sixteenths, and then eventually triplets, fa mi re do re, si do la, si do re, breathing in between on a syncopation to bridge and tense up and build another line. If I define them, describe them so detailedly, perhaps I end up playing it to prove a point. Oh, Bach is so expressive, more than you think. Let me give it to you all. Perhaps that's what I did. I should perhaps be able to play it in a more distantiated pattern, just a little bit more held back, and say, you reach to it as a listener. I don't have to display it so openly to you. And so to maintain a certain reserve that could be considered right for the context of the Baroque era compared to the classical era, the Romantic era, the modern era, the postmodern era, the post-tonal era, all the eras that respectfully supposed to represent by analogy their time periods in the context of their own anxieties and psychological mirror of their beings. So it is true that when I play an example to prove a point, I tend to overstate it to make it proven. And then when I perform to perform, not to convince in the sense of conference conviction or rhetorical, pedantic, call it sometimes, desire to be convincing, then I play with more distanciation. Not distanciation, with a certain reserve that is elegance. The elegance of being. You don't spill all your feelings so openly, so raw on the stage for the audience. It's so difficult but essential, lifelong search to express the right balance between the intimate and the universal, the expression and the form. Ravel was often quoted liking Haydn because of his expression of all of humanity within the form, not needing to go beyond it. So perhaps and for sure, when I want to convey the importance of the affects that create this sense of expression of the soulful description in Bach's right hand of this Le Monde, I go beyond the contextual time period things. I should be able to play it with all its essence, but withheld instead of openly spilled. You see, one never ends to try. The expression of the detail over the whole is the difference between the two interpretations I illustrated my thoughts with when I played the Allemande in D major. In a way, you could say one is a little faster, one takes more time. To do what? To smell every second rose, or to reach the point of the statement? After all, there is an intelligent discourse, not only a beautiful detail over a beautiful detail, but there is a flow. There is a sense of rhetorical organization of a sentence that reaches its point even if it takes some sideways before it touches the point of the story that wants to be illustrated through this piece. I find that to be fascinating because you have to find the balance as a performer, but also, of course, as a teacher. But differently, the teacher, in essence, explains what the student has to construct. While when you play as a student or a teacher, but performer, you don't explain in words. You have to bring all your thoughts through the notes of the composer. All life in each note. And in fact, at this point, the student and the teacher are at equal, not level of knowledge, because the experience of companionship for 4 decades with a piece or 3 weeks for the student is inevitably different perspective. Or the knowledge of the other genres of pieces written by the same composer, or the knowledge of the other composers of that time period. So you create a complete better knowledge for your informed interpretation of the piece from the ecosystem in which this piece was conceived. And of course, we played away from its time period, away from its original instrument, away from its philosophical understanding of the world compared to today, at least for some. In other words, it's more than a translation, it's a transliteration of the whole meaning of it. The length of sound, the shortness of sound, the meaningful audacity of a modulation compared to what we're used to. In a way, the dissonances and the consonances have a different value according to the time period where they are used for the expression that they bring in to the statement. And if you play something like the following composer's style after Bach, that would be Haydn, establishing the sonata form, away from the imitation on harpsichord of dances or singing arias, but creating its own through the form, art form, even if the essence of the, you can say the thematic material or the motivic material is still very contrasting, like you would do in a dance compared to another dance, or an aria compared to another aria, where the harpsichord, now fortepiano to be music, is expressed as a not imitation but as a transposition of that idealized artwork, which is no more to be danced or be sung, but you represent it on another instrument. And then what is interesting is that the form prevails on the thematic materials. That's why the sonata form. And in a way, Beethoven, who is perhaps the worst student of Haydn, in the sense that he best adopted Haydn's formal organization of the chaos of nature by mankind, symmetry and prevailing tonalities and structures and organization of space, and how you do the bridges and how you introduce this and that. Everything was very codified by Haydn. And Beethoven rejected all, but in order to express his own meaning of music, or through piano, or through anything. It's, he needed to break the rules of the form to express his essence. And Haydn didn't need to. So when Beethoven writes two movement sonatas with fugues or with theme and variations, they could be called fantasies, which some of them are called, but most of them could have been told like ballades, which is a form of literature storytelling. A rhapsody in ancient Greece was the storyteller of the mythology, accompanying himself on the sitar. So the rhetorical storytelling could be free of form. And in Beethoven's case, it becomes even closer to our modernity, which is very strange or striking, given the fact that he was in the early 19th century after all, is that he fragments the thought process. So all these rhetorical, ancient European, Greek, or Roman way of expressing the line in the arias and in the recitativos, the spoken, the sung, the storytelling in Beethoven is fragmented. He takes a piece of this, a piece of that, he develops it, he collides it, he fights it. The sonata form brings a certain organization of the chaos of nature through rules in which you put inside the box the right quantities of the elements of the drive. Would it be emotional or rhythmic or harmonic or all of the above? And in the case of Beethoven, not only does he play and compose rather for the piano sonatas towards the later part of his life, and I don't think is always related to his deafness, though many people consider that to be the case. I think in a way he always wanted to exponentially expand the extended limitations of the expression through the form. He broke the form, so he wanted to break the ranges, the highest possible, the lowest possible, the scream and the rumble. That's perhaps metaphorical, but nevertheless true. And the fact is that he takes a melodic line, he interrupts it, he then writes a few bars of kind of a recitativo, then he goes to an aria which he interrupts by a fugue, which is interrupted by the return of the aria in a different key. Then he restarts the fugue, but in the opposite direction, inverting the subject. And then he finishes in a blossoming excitement with a rising coda. That's what he does in his 31st sonata, opus 110, in A flat major for his middle and last movement. Wow. Where did we get to from where we were? Oh, I couldn't because I shouldn't, and this is the form, and I shouldn't go beyond the group of syllables to organize my rhymes in that order, and I have to be creative within the rules. That was the idea of poetry, and that was the idea of most of classical expression of art forms. You learn by the limitations of the genre how to in fact break the limitations, how to speak outside of the box, express yourself freely within but outside. You break, you hatch the egg and you become the bird and you fly. Now the purpose of the form was not only to lock tight the creativity of the musicians. I think the purpose of the form was to organize the thoughts. And that's a very Western European philosophical organization of the chaos of nature through symmetry and hierarchy. Principal key, secondary key, principal theme, secondary theme, and allegiance to the first theme in the original key, and organization of characters which are inevitably contrasting, like masculine, feminine, very basically said, and then in the development they come out as a unity. This thesis and then synthesis out of the way you organize your thoughts is not a suite of elements that you expose, and then the listener, the reader, the person who receives the form of art, through their own culture, their own philosophy, their own way of being taught how to understand how things happen, then either they find it boring, like repeats, I don't need the repeat, or I need a repeat with a different set of expressions, which I think is wrong. They should just consider the repeat as a restatement in order to get deeper in the thinking of what the music very often, in this case, brings you in an interiorized capacity of reflection. And sometimes you need that repeat to deepen your reflection. It's not boring, and it shouldn't be distracting you at any point, because they're afraid that too austere, if it is, you might get bored and you might stop it. I think that every art form should be respected not only for its essence, but also for its representation, its form. You could have an echo cell, you can have a restatement, you can have a restatement inside each informative thematic material. You can have it just on a group of elements that you repeat, is written on the score to do. And so we can always argue about informed performing, saying in the past they added more unwritten or hinted mostly ornamented decoration, and then they played the first time just bare and the second time very decorated. I don't think so. Besides, I don't know. None of us do, in fact, what they did when they performed it. We can assume, we can have educated knowledge and guess. We have treatises, we have people describing performances. We have very serious and solid amount of knowledge of the past musically than any past time composers had for their own past. So in fact, we are in a way beautifully informed, overly informed, in a way, perhaps in a way, censoring ourselves, over-informed. In fact, when you know less, you dare more. You try more with certain naivete or with certain lack of knowledge, but in a way it allows you to attempt a phrasing, a direction, a way to think with your intuition only rather than your knowledge. If your knowledge is only to stop you from your intuition, at some point it dries you out from your inspiration. It's easy to say, difficult to do, and less to measure how much of which and when, and who decides what it is, the proportion of which. You should this, you shouldn't do that, and you should dare more of that. And so the performance practice, even if we are not totally, but perhaps very, very more than before aware for our past, we are in the present. We play with an instrument of the day for ears of the day, for people of today. If they are informed of yesterday or not, we're not supposed to know. We just play for all of them. We in fact play the piece, and then whoever catches it receives it in whatever capacity of their understanding or emotional connection to it. They very well can say, I disconnect, I don't like it, even if it's for wrong reasons, or the wrong perception, or the wrong expectation. If you expect to hear a piece by Beethoven sounding like Mozart, you're disappointed. If you expect a piece like Bach to sound like Bizet, you are disappointed, obviously. But that's what happens today, is that people play a piano recital with a piece by Scarlatti, and then by Beethoven, and then by Scriabin. So what do you hear? Cut flowers in a bouquet, basically. And if somebody plays the complete 48 prelude and fugues, you might have half of the audience leave after the third or the fourth, because the capacity of attention for something similar, but with depth and subtlety in its differences, is lost in translation for those who are not informed, because they'll find it boring. So if art forms for uninformed people, when you perform it, have to denature the piece from its what you think is its consistent and real nature. Um, you don't try to seduce them, to distract them with all kinds of effects, tempi, articulation, ornaments. It's a difficult choice because in a performance you try to seduce. And seduction is good. After all, it's human nature to be in good rapport with each other, to be perhaps not actively seducing. That's perhaps too much of a strong statement of the action. But I would say it's more about, even intellectually, not only sensually or emotionally, through the piece, trying to convince at least. And in a way, an intellectual conviction is part seduction too, or at least bringing to you people who perhaps don't think like you about the piece. I'm very convinced, personally, that there is a level of integrity in one's interpretation one should always search for, regardless of how you would think the audience will perceive, receive, or reject it. If you don't play with your conviction, your drive, your understanding of the traction through the tempo, of the pulse, of the statement, with the melodic and harmonic component, all the components, put them whichever way you want to hierarchize them. There is a whole that you present to the audience like a statement, like an eloquent speech, eloquent dialogue, eloquent anything, eloquent being the real art of persuasion. Not cheating, not saying I'm going to persuade you by colorizing it if it's black and white, or ornamenting it if I think it's too austere, and then I make the repeat more appealing so that you stay around for the next movement. I don't think that is an interpretational integrity. Does it mean that you have to be disconnected from the audience and just play like a priest directly to the piece as if to God, and then the audience are there miscellaneously around you to sort of enjoy watching you pray your God, so to say, while you play the piece? I think you need to have a certain, and you have to have it built by your conviction as well as, of course, the teacher, but also the meaning of why you do what you do. Because you have to connect to the audience in order to convey to them what is meaningful to you from the text, which by itself doesn't play music, is silent. So you bring it to life your way, and you want them to adhere, to connect with your way of liking it, the tempo, the articulation, the phrasing, the way you do it. And of course they can say, I like this piece better by such and such because it moves me more, or I find it more modern, and I find it more driven, and your tempo is boring, and you're being too much, I don't have enough emotion from your playing. Perhaps the words are not always right, the way they describe your playing, or they want to explain what they like if they do, or what they don't like if they don't like. And then you have, criticisms out of jealousy, criticisms out of superiority attitude. You're not supposed to play like this. I'll teach you the right way. I'll tell you which way. Listen to this. You're wrong. You don't understand. That's possible too. The problem is who to trust. And besides your own instinct, but also inevitably the connection with the teacher, the connection with the performer. You learn from a performer as much as from a teacher. A performer per se doesn't explain in words, and a performer who plays in a way conveys a lot of the meaning that the teacher has to, in a way, inevitably explain. And so, in a way, to explain with words what the music explains with the sounds, or hints, or perhaps you're afraid it might not completely by itself be finally reaching its point to the audience member. But the audience member is not a singular kind of person. It's all kinds of people. They come into the piece because they want to hear you, or because they want to hear the piece from the melodic perspective that they can catch on. Perhaps they cannot detect inner voices in their hearing because it's not trained. And they hear perhaps the rhythmic aspect that drives them into it, and they go, wow, like that. So they enter in your piece while you play it from a different perspective than yours, which is also a lot the industry of playing it, but not only, obviously. While you construct it as a conductor, you play it as an orchestra musicians, or you at the same time try to, in a didactical way, to convince the audience that the choice of your tempi, phrasing, articulations, pedal, or direction of line and dynamics and everything combined corresponds to the way that the piece means to you. So it's not the universal truth, it's not even your truth, it's perhaps a temporary truth that becomes the moment of sharing with the audience, that during this ephemeral moment is making sense. Could be the acoustics that helps, that enhances with the resonance, a piano that responds better to you, lighter, heavier action, make different ways of reacting for our detailed articulations. Of course we know that. Does the audience care for all that? Probably less. Does the audience come and hear it from the same point of view if they know the piece, like jury members of a competition for general repertoire that is famous? Then they have their opinions and you can't satisfy them because the rubato is too much for the one, not for the other, etc. And then if you play for people who don't know, they connect it psychologically mostly, emotionally mostly, to ways they think of love, life, perhaps in a book, perhaps in a famous novel, and they connect to it. You never know on which level they connect their thoughts with their emotions when you share with them a piece of music, regardless how much it's explained in the program notes if they read them, or even without reading them. After all, they want to listen to it just like receive it and see how much of it they perceive in that reception. And you become, in a way, the narrator, the orator, the cantor of that text, which by itself, might eloquent as it is, not be convincing or conveying its complete intent, then through you, the way you played that day. And people could remember this decades after the performance, regardless how the performance really objectively was, because they were in thirst and search for something that you brought them. They could have read it on their own, like a book is read by the reader without the author standing next to them, or somebody, an actor, if not the author himself or herself, dictating it to you, or narrating it to you loud voice. And the way they say it might capture you more than the way you read it. Perhaps by reading it you misunderstand or misguess, or understand differently some of the innuendos of the descriptions of the characters, of the places, of the narration, of the storytelling, of the tempo of the storytelling, everything. But you read it on your own. Here you have you as a performer being the cantor, the spokesman, spokeswoman and spokesman of the composer's intent from whatever you think the authenticity of it was. And I find this modernity of saying, today we don't have to do this and that because we are in a modern time. We don't have to do the repeats. We don't have to do ornaments. We just play the raw material because we go directly to the point, and all the rest was just over affected elements of expression. Well, perhaps. But in order to plunge, to immerse ourselves in their musical, creative world in which they bathed, of their own time period, in their own geography, wherever they were, we need to, in a way, isolate ourselves from what we have experienced since in terms of emotional height, in different styles, genres, and then try to still reconnect to this and find, as a listener, regardless if we are informed or just accidental listener, to connect to the heart of the storytelling's meaning, for what it is or what it is to us. So authenticity, yes, but drive and personal statement mostly. And I find that when you can combine your intuitive drive with your knowledge and not have one overwhelm the other, you're sincerely convinced in your honest description, and then if your technique translates to the fullest detail your understanding of it, in your feeling of it, then your technique serves your artists, and your performance becomes a conviction rather than only a reading or a recitation or a correct recitation. It becomes correct, if not with mistakes or without, because it's human nature, but it becomes a statement that comes alive ephemerally from the page and goes back for the next person who will do it. And there are people before us and people after us who will put alive this, or bring to life these texts for whatever they represent to them at that point, the universality of their message and the intimacy of their connection to us as humans, as musicians, and as fellow humans. All this philosophizing is probably too heavy to take in account when you perform just a piece. And perhaps you shouldn't think of it at all these levels, because it might stop you from the drive to just play and perform and share and have your enthusiasm just enthuse the others, literally what it is. To enthuse them in reflection, to enthuse them in blossoming their excitement.